Okay, welcome back. This is part 2 of the Basis of Assessment video. We have looked at the assessment brief, we've looked at the learning outcomes, and now we're looking at the generic marking scheme, which I think most of us find the most challenging thing to get our heads around. So the marking scheme essentially helps us work out what grade we want to award students. And in higher education, rather than using kind of an A, B, C system, we use a 0 to 100 percentage point system. And at BIM, we are currently actually in kind of a phase of using two systems where anything that's under the Bath Spa regulations, we use any grade from 0 to 100, apart from the 9s, but we'll get onto that. And under the Sussex regs, we have a categorical marking system where we only have select grades within each banding. There is a whole separate video on that, so please do check that out. But essentially, we have a number of bandings. And students are classified in a number of ways. So first class is anything above 70%, that's generally considered excellent. Second class is generally considered as very good, and that's between 60 and 69.9. Second class is good, 50 to 59.9. The third class is 40 and upwards. Anything below 40 is a fail. And new markers tend to be quite generous. So I think, 50 can seem 50 out of 100 can seem quite harsh, but actually that's not a terrible grade, that's considered good. So it's something you're going to have to get used to, and the generic marking scheme can help you understand that a little bit more. So it's really important that you get your head around the marking scheme at each level. So words like good and very good and pass and excellent don't tell us much if we don't understand what that looks like at each level. So a good at level 4 will be different to a good at level 6. Of course, because students are at different stages of their learning and their development. So you can find these generic marking schemes on the briefs in the course handbooks, and students can also find them on the home pages of their courses on Moodle as well. And it's something that you, as I said, something you really need to get stuck into. It's challenging at first because you've got the same generic marking scheme across all assessments, across all courses at each level. So we use the same one to decide what grade a student gets in a practical guitar exam as a 2,500 word essay. So it's difficult, and you need to really be clear on how you're using it, and also be clear in your feedback at how you have used it to reach the grade that you've reached for the student. And the feedback templates now ask you to do this because it's something that the external examiners bring up every year. And also something that the students bring up too. They want to know why they've got the grade they've got. So the feedback templates ask you to select or copy and paste in, depending on which system you're using, the descriptor, which is this bit here, the descriptor of the banding that you're awarding within, and then also go on to explain in more detail how it applies to that work. So you may award 2-1 for something, for a piece of work that has aspects that mostly sit within the 2-1 category, but there may be things that may be in the first category or in the 2-2 category. You need to explain to the student exactly what it is that puts it within this banding and how they might improve their work so they can reach a higher banding in the future. The criteria are also really helpful to help you reset if you are starting marking at a different level. So, for example, a first at BA1 is not the same as a first at BA3. At BA3 we expect, commercially academically confident work, lots of critical and analytical thinking, really high level research. And at BA1 we're more interested in, good supporting external knowledge and research and good referencing and coherence of ideas, but that high level critical thinking is not so essential for a first at level 4 in year 1. So it does help you remember that first 2, 1, 2, 2 are not the same each level. You need to really think about that when you're marking to make sure you're not marking too leniently or too harshly when you go to mark different work. So let's look at a few principles of marking then. So firstly, we don't mark to a curve. So we don't ask you for a certain quota of grades. We want you to just look at the work in front of you, look at the assessment brief, look at the learning outcomes, look at the criteria, and make your judgment based on those things, not on having a certain number of grades in each category, which is something that some institutions ask you to do. We do, however, look at a graph throughout this whole process. So if you're using the submission checklist, you'll be able to see a graph as you put grades in as you go along, which can be really helpful for you in case you're falling into kind of strange patterns, or also noticing that students are all falling down in one area, which is preventing them from getting a certain grade. But it's also really useful for us in the moderation process, for external examiners to see where there might be an issue, perhaps with the level of challenge, or perhaps with student learning, sometimes with the teaching, hopefully not the teaching, but it is a useful tool because we generally expect to award most of the marks in that middle area, to kind of 2-2, 2-1, with a few students excelling and a few students not doing so well, and that's generally what we're hoping for. Doesn't always pan out that way, sometimes that's fine, and there's a totally legitimate reason why that hasn't worked. Sometimes students have just done really, really well and surprised everyone, but we do want to understand what those results look like and why they look like that. If you fail someone, just be totally sure they've failed the criteria. We try to moderate most fails, and any problems might trigger a full remark. Obviously we want it to be fair and make sure students are given every opportunity to achieve and progress if they deserve it. And also, I mentioned this before, but do not use borderline grades. So if you're using the categorical marking system, you won't be able to, so that's great. But if you are using the old system still, do not award 39s, 49s, 59s, etc. We want our marks to be firm, and these are very difficult to justify, that one mark where it hasn't got over into the next boundary. Watch out for these. External examiners will bring it up if they see it, moderators will bring it up if they see it, and ask for the grade to be changed. If you're unsure about any grading decisions, get a second opinion, speak to someone in your marking team, speak to the module leader, if it's not you, the course leader, speak to me, totally happy to take a look and give you an opinion. And yes, as I said, check whether the assignment uses categorical marking. There is a whole video on this, and if you do not use it, it will be sent back to you to remark, so it's important that you do. Okay, feedback then. So a few basics, which we'll go through in other videos as well, but there is a template for all formal assessment feedback. This has been developed following guidance from our external examiners. It helps us to ensure consistency and clarity for students. So far it seems to be going pretty well. We're getting really good feedback from the students about it, and hopefully it's helping speed up some of the marking as well. The templates have been designed to cover all of the important aspects, so the things we've spoken about in these videos, the learning outcomes and generic criteria, and also they're designed to be really developmental and supportive for the students. If you want to complete audio feedback, that's totally fine, but we want you to follow the same kind of categories, so it's still really consistent. And feedback is either completed on or uploaded to Moodle for students, or the BIM VLE. We use two systems, Gradebook, which is Moodle's in-house one, and Turnitin. But for all Gradebook assignments, because it's a bit clunky, we give you Excel feedback sheets, which we then export into Moodle, because that allows us to use the format we want to use. And you can find videos on how to use both of these systems. A few other basic things then. The length of feedback, just something to be aware of. If it's too brief, it's going to get sent back to you because it's unlikely to cover the minimum requirements, so the things that we ask for. Brief feedback tends to be really narrative in style rather than developmental, so it just explains what happened in the assessment or explains what the essay says, which isn't very helpful, either in terms of helping us understand why it's got the grade it's got, or in helping the student improve. It does come across as lazy. Students will complain about it, and it can be very obvious if you are one of several markers. If your feedback is looking pretty brief and someone else has written a good chunk, students do compare feedback and they will notice and they will complain, and then we often end up having to remark it anyway, so something to avoid. And if it's too long, yeah, it might seem great for students, but actually it kind of just eats up too much time for everyone. It can be really overwhelming for students, difficult to process and respond to. It can set unrealistic expectations, so if you write 1,000 words and then another marker writes 250 words, the student starts feeling hard done by the other marker, and that's not really fair. It's also difficult for moderators because the moderators don't get paid per word, they get paid for the rate for that assessment. So if you're writing loads and loads, it's putting quite a big burden on the moderator as well. And also the templates are restrictive in terms of word count. And that's not necessarily deliberate, that's just the way it is, but that gives you a pretty good indicator of when you are going a bit overboard because you're running out of space. So try and stick within the limits of those templates. But also, you know, protect your time because you don't get paid more for writing more. So, you know, just as long as it's useful for students and you're happy with it, you don't need to write loads. And finally, this is the first in many videos and resources, so please do check them out. We've got videos which explain in more detail how the actual admin works, how the exams team make all this stuff happen, how to use the different systems, category marking, how to write effective feedback, all kinds of the policies and processes around misconduct, penalties, dyslexia mitigation, how to be an effective moderator, and some other things as well. So please do check them out, and I hope you find them useful. Please forward any feedback to me or another member of the education team, and come speak to us if you need any help. Thanks, bye.